There's a story behind the story of the Bible, and it's much more complicated and interesting than you think. Here are some tools to read the Bible in context in this episode of the Accessible Faith Project. Hi there, I'm John, and welcome to the Accessible Faith Project. If you're looking for insights into the Bible, faith, and history in ways that engage your brain regardless of your faith stance, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. No matter what story or passage you might be reading in the Bible, there's a story as to how it got there. I'm not talking about the content, although that has something to do with it, but rather the story of how it became a part of the work that it is a part of, and then of course how that work became part of the Bible. It is far too simple to say that God wanted it there, because that glosses over some really important details that can help us really understand what it means. Knowing the context can greatly deepen our understanding of biblical stories and make it easier for us to connect with them. By contrast, avoiding context and simply pulling out random sentences out of the Bible without doing this work can do a whole lot more harm than good. For example, I recently saw a biblical quote on an inspirational daily calendar that said, "If you worship me, it will all be yours," with the verse citation of Luke chapter 4, verse 7. And while it may sound inspiring enough, it's less inspirational if you realize who said it, and I'll give you a little hint. Even with something as simple as this, context is really important. Something we should also be careful of is many of these stories behind the stories have a tradition of their own. For example, the first 5 books of the Bible were once thought to be penned by Moses himself, but even a cursory reading shows this not to be the case. None of the books make the claim themselves, and it is very unlikely that Moses would have written about himself in the third person. Yet because the figure of Moses is the embodiment of the law in the tradition of Hebrew scripture, the first 5 books of the Bible were often referred to as the books of Moses, and many eventually took this to mean that these books were by Moses. And we should be aware of what those traditions are, but we also need to be ready to set them aside because they can get in the way of us understanding the Bible in context. So instead of just blindly going with the tradition, here are some tools that can really help us understand the context of the Bible. And while I will eventually have videos on this channel that will get into the context of individual passages and stories, what I'm talking about here is a broader set of tools. These are some almost universal questions to ask, and each of them really deserve their own video. But taken together, they can help us get an understanding of the context and in turn deepen our understanding behind the story. First, when was it written? Understanding when a passage from the Bible was written goes a long way to help read it in context. By setting the document into the historical events of the day, it can help us put a frame around it and the various situations it is trying to address. Psalm 137 is a lament with a rather dark ending that makes far more sense when we realize that it was likely written during the early period of the exile after the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in the early 6th century BCE. When is it set? For most of the works in the Bible, they are set in the same period in which they were written, so this question is largely already answered with the when was it written, but not always. Job, for example, is set in a time in the distant foggy past well before Moses. However, as scholars have noted, the book is written in a rather sophisticated form of Hebrew that simply did not exist any earlier than the 4th century BCE. So while Job is a relatively recent work in Hebrew scripture, it is using a primeval setting to reflect on and challenge ancient wisdom. Where was it written? It is also useful to know where a given work was written. Sometimes the author tells you outright, and we know that at least part of the book of Revelation, for example, was written on the Greek island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea off the coast of Asia Minor, what is now modern-day Turkey. And that's well removed from Jerusalem, but it is in close proximity to Greek towns and cities that housed tiny Christian populations in the Eastern Roman Empire. Knowing that bit of information helps us know that John of Patmos was dealing with concerns of cultural absorption and identity rather than violent revolt and uprising, which would have been the case had he wrote it near Jerusalem. Remember that distances in this day and age were a lot bigger than we might perceive them to be today. Who is it written for? All writing, sacred or otherwise, has a target audience. Even authors who claim to write only for themselves are still writing for an audience, even if it is an audience of one. The target audience for most of Paul's letters are evident in the opening lines, and they were specific church communities in the northern Mediterranean. The last 26 chapters of Isaiah were written for a people who had been raised in captivity away from their homeland, a full generation after Psalm 137 lamented the fall of it. Sometimes it's pretty obvious who the target audience was, but in many places that is not clear. Why was it written? Everything from a shopping list to the largest novel has a reason for why it exists. If it exists on paper, there's a reason why it got there. Many of the stories of Jesus only started to be put in written form almost a generation after the crucifixion. Why? Partly because the early followers of Jesus couldn't read or write, but they could pass along the stories. And when they began to die off, right around the time of the First Jewish-Roman War, writing it down became a much higher priority. It also helped that the movement had started gaining those rare followers who were capable of writing, and so they did. And what is the style of writing? This question is way more important than we realize. Genesis chapter 1, for example, is written in the form of a poem or song, complete with a rhythmical structure to it, and it is repeated verses. Paul's letters are, well, letters. The letters of Peter, on the other hand, are more like a sermon. Leviticus is a long-form legal text, not like that's a surprise. Knowing what the style of writing is also helps us frame whatever part of the Bible we are reading, giving us a better understanding of the words. Now you'll notice that I've left off the question of who wrote it, largely because with a few exceptions, we aren't as sure of who the writers of the individual books are, despite some pretty deep traditions around it. That's okay, but answering the other questions first can give us some idea about the author of each book. Now, while this is just an overview, the story of the stories in the Bible are much more in-depth and much more interesting than many of us realize. These tools are just a few to get us started, not just of the books of the Bible, but also the broader picture when it comes to faith and history. Hopefully, this opens door, if but a crack, to realize that there's a whole lot more to the Bible than just a quote of the day. So what if this was new to you? What other questions does it raise? Let me know in the comments section down below. So if you want to explore this in ways that will expand your horizons and deepen your understanding regardless of your faith stance, then come and join us on this journey by clicking on subscribe and that little bell icon and you're set to go. And I'll see you next time on the Accessible Faith Project.